On Rebuilders today, we are looking at 2023, the year ahead, and the mood that surrounds this year.
What is the mood of 2023? What to expect, how to prepare yourself for it, how to understand it, how to be ahead of the curve. We're talking all about that today on Rebuilders.
Yeah, it's a great episode. And if you want to know any of our resources, we mention a bunch of articles in the episode ahead. You can subscribe to our mailing list by heading to rebuilders.co. Let's get into it. Hi, welcome to Rebuilders. We're back for 2023. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you both? How was your January break?
Good. Had a big January break as we do down under, which is our big main year break when it's the midst of summer. Mm-hmm. Did you get back to Bendigo?
I did. I went up for a couple of days. It was a bit later than anticipated. You know, COVID still around. So,
Yes.
but went up just after New Year's. Saw the family.
Nice.
And you didn't return to your home region of the Barossa. You instead travelled north.
Went to New South Wales. My wife's family's all in New South Wales now.
Yeah.
Went to Wagga Wagga and
Wagga Wagga.
to Wollongong.
Cool.
Yeah, both places I have not been. So it was great to visit and see some of the great land of Australia.
The Gong. Hello to anyone listening in Bendigo. Wagga Wagga.
It's a beautiful place. I expected a big town and it's actually a significant regional city.
Wollongong.
Wollongong, yeah. So loved it. It was great to visit.
I haven't been to Wagga Wagga for years.
I've never been.
Great aunt used to live there, yeah.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of out of the way if you're driving from Melbourne to Sydney or Canberra.
You don't go through it.
I know going from Adelaide to Sydney, you would go through Wagga, but it's a great regional city as well.
There you go.
Yep.
Oh, just great. Everything's great.
Everything's great. On the Murrumbidgee, which is a fun word to say. Murrumbidgee River.
Murrumbidgee River.
Yeah.
And if any of you have no idea what we're talking about,
Google Maps.
Google Maps.
Google Maps.
Yes,
Google
that's what I was going to
Maps.
say.
Yeah. Down the road from Narrandera.
Narrandera. Are you just wanting to say words that are fun to say?
Yeah. Australia has lots of
Fun
words.
place names. They do. We do. Well, it is great to be back. And as we kick off 2023, we're going to start by looking at a bunch of articles that you have come across over the last few weeks, Mark. And then we'll zoom out and take sort of a meta view of what is potentially happening in culture, the shifts that are occurring and how they impact us or how they can help inform what we're doing as leaders in Christian contexts.
Yeah. It's interesting, over January I did listen to some podcasts, and there's a lot of podcasts were doing their January predictions and trends they're expecting in 2023. And I sort of felt like what I wanted to do is capture that, a kind of mood shift that is occurring, the mood of 2023. And I think also it's just been really interesting that a lot of the sort of things that we've forecasted, foreshadowed, been observing, I think it's starting to really come to the fore in 2023. So just a few interesting ones. This is a fascinating, a little tip for viewing the media and news. Often people ask me, how do you read the news? Often, a lot of the news is, I think, reading articles and often reading what are often really key leads that are buried in the story, as they say.
Yeah.
So there was an interesting article in Reuters about the big Davos World Economic Forum thing, which has been happening, which is really the sort of gathering of the global elite in a town of Davos in Switzerland. Davos has become a bit of a cultural meme because there's lots of conspiracy theories around the WF and so on. But it's definitely this place of the gathering of the global elite. Anyway, they talked about the sort of mood there, and just fascinating. They sort of talked about this gloominess that was in the mood, but then also trying to not be downcast about where the world's going.
Yes.
But just this interesting little detail I noticed that PricewaterhouseCoopers, the sort of big global accountancy firm, presented some research that they had been doing of, I think it's 4,000 chief executives of some of the world's biggest companies. And this was presented at Davos. 40% of these key chief executives of some of the world's biggest companies believe that their companies will not survive the next 10 years economically.
Wow.
And that's just a fascinating mood shift from where we've been and sort of the confidence in the world and that sort of sense that things are changing. I also noticed another story which caught my attention, which was in Copenhagen, is probably the world's most famous or seen as the best restaurant in the world, Noma. And plates there can go for over $1,000, which is pretty pricey.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot for a meal.
And you have to book in advance. And the chef there, Rene Redzepi, is sort of seen as, one of the most innovative cooks in the, chefs in the world, rather.
Sure.
And it was fascinating that basically he announced on January 10th that the world's best restaurant is closing for financial reasons.
Huh.
And interesting, the story behind this was that despite having $1,000 plates, that what had happened was that some of the ways that these sort of high-end Michelin kitchens operate is that they have people come in who are interns. And the people come in as interns and they'll work for like 3 months with this world-renowned chef. Now, if you've worked for this guy or you work in one of these top Michelin restaurants, that means you can go back to your home country or go wherever and they're like going to employ you because you've learned from the master. But interestingly, there was sort of this pushback, and we're seeing this all around the place where people are looking at, issues of what they call wage theft and so on. And so this sort of online campaign began of people who'd worked at Noma in Denmark, and then there was this push that he should be paying the interns a fair wage. And effectively, when they crunched the numbers, what it meant was that they just simply could not run a restaurant at that level at that cost. So he has to shut down, and he's chosen to shut down. I think he's going to do something else. But I just thought it was really interesting in this, and you'll see this theme as we sort of tease out these stories of high values, high ideals, starting to meet cost, the actual cost of things. Another story, which is very similar, is that on January the 1st, a set of laws came into play in Germany. And Germany's just passed some of the most significant laws around ethics in its supply chain.
Yeah.
Now, I can't remember if we've spoken about it before, but one of the big moves in investing has been this idea of ESG, and there's investment firms like BlackRock. I think it's is the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink. I'll just fact check that.
Yes, correct. Larry Fink.
He's been a real advocate for these ESG type loans and investments. Basically what that is, environment, society, and governance. So basically investing and ensuring that where you're putting your money has these very high ethical standards around what people are doing with the environment and all kinds of very different social causes and good governance and so on. There's a backlash coming against that because some people see it as sort of a Trojan horse of bringing different sort of social values into, so like if a local council wants to borrow money, or that company, it then has to conform to these various sort of social agendas.
Yes.
And the German government has been working on this similar thing. But what's really interesting is the scale of this. So basically, any company, from my understanding, dealing with a German company has to agree to all of these different sort of ESG type measurements around all kinds of things, from freedom of religion to the place of women to all of these different things. But that's demanded along the entire supply chain. So, for example, if a company is building a renewable battery and it's getting those raw earth materials from, say, Mali, they have to adhere to almost the German level of what you would expect, say, in a place like Germany, but through the entire touching of their supply chain. And I think basically, if the firms don't do this, they could be fined up to 2% of their global turnover, which 2% of a global turnover, a big sort of multinational, is huge. So basically, it's all around and the risk is actually on the companies, not the sort of subcontractors, if you like. They have to identify, assess, prevent, and remedy human rights and human environmental impacts along the entirety of their supply chains. Now, again, there's a lot that's very admirable about this and the introduction of values and ethics into this space. But what it means is that there's a lot of the world which simply don't line up to those values. You think about the supply chain, say, you may have the car factory where perhaps they're selling a car, and perhaps in Germany that car plant's got the electric batteries and they're at that standard. But again, too, what does that mean in some mine somewhere?
Yeah, what's the flow-on effect all the way down the chain?
And just whether this is a point where it's going to put Germany at a significant disadvantage in a world where you're competing with countries like Russia or China and others who are just simply not going to do this. And what does this mean? It's this coming together And this is one of the big themes of high cost with high values, high ethics.
Yes.
So it's really interesting to see how that's beginning to play out. There was another interesting stat as well that you've got at Davos. There's a lot of talk about, ESG and sustainability and the environment and equality and diversity and tolerance. But it's interesting, Oxfam released a study which said that since 2020, since the beginning of the pandemic, the richest 1% of the world have accumulated close to 2/3 of all new wealth. So what you're seeing is at the same time that corporates and governments are talking increasingly about equality and so on, particularly in the West, that during that time you have seen, and you've seen all kinds of initiatives around, environment, gender, et cetera, but during that time you've seen one of the most significant gaps in economic inequality emerge. Which is just fascinating contradiction. So again, you've got high ideals and high ethics, but how does that link to this reality at play? It's really fascinating. So there was an interesting article in the Sydney Morning Herald by Lionel Laurent, and he talks about the fact, or I think it's a he, that talks about the fact that what to expect in 2023. It's hard to believe that the post-COVID world at one point was supposed to usher in a new consumer boom worthy of the Roaring '20s, consumer-led boom. Instead, crises have only been piling up, from war to inflation, triggering disparate, overlapping shocks. Some are calling it a polycrisis. Now, the term polycrisis, I think, was coined just recently in the Financial Times, wrote a very influential piece. And apparently at the Davos summit, everyone was using this word.
Yeah.
And I thought it was just fascinating, reflecting on our conversations in this podcast. In many ways, we talked about the networked world and how crises fall into each other and exacerbate, and how that's creating a grey zone. So it's interesting seeing in the culture that people are now using this term, which I think is another example that there's this mood shift.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, like what Lionel Laurent is suggesting is that we're now moving into, I'll actually read from the article here. Societies have shown themselves to be remarkably able to adapt. Inflation is showing signs of easing, a relief. But Pickett asset management strategists still expect global growth to slow to 1.7% in 2023, with stagnation in most developed economies and outright recession in Europe. The realistic 20s has less of a ring to it, referring to the Roaring '20s.
Yes.
But that's more likely a view of next year. So it's interesting. The headline is "The Roaring '20s are over. Time to get real." And so this is a big theme. This return to reality.
Yes.
This resetting of expectations. So that's quite an interesting sort of engagement with the issues, and sort of in some ways from the sublime to the ridiculous. There was an article in the Australian news outlet news.com.au and the opinion piece by Mary Madigan, and the fantastic headline, which is just guaranteed to get clicks, got my click, was "Millennials are now behaving like their boomer parents thanks to inflation." The cost of living crisis isn't just impacting homeowners. Young people are feeling the pinch in the word's in there, shockingly different way. Okay, so I want to know the shockingly different way. I'm just going to just read you this because it's just so fantastic. Inflation is rising, and now I live more like a boomer than a millennial. Yes, living costs have become so bad that my lifestyle is more like a semi-retired mum than a hot young person. Globally, inflation is the highest it's been in 30 years. This means everything is expensive, from groceries to petrol to rent. No one comes out scathed when inflation swells. Forget the dream of buying a home being dead. My goal of buying a Gucci belt is in the morgue. Just fantastic. Just.
I really relate with that one.
Yes,
yeah, me too.
Yes. In 2023, being a millennial means Ubers, Uber Eats, brunches, dinners, and same-day orders from the Iconic, which is I don't know if that's everywhere around the world.
No,
it's just
I think it's Australian.
But it's an online retailer. Fashion, basically.
Yeah.
My boomer parents have constantly rolled their eyes at these antics and ranted and raved about how they never lived as lavishly as I did. I'd roll my eyes right back and explain that I'm in my Paris Hilton era and must be left alone to make bad choices while I'm young enough that it won't ruin my life. However, inflation is slowly stripping away all the fringe benefits of being a young person. she goes into a number of discussions around this, and they're just these fantastic suggestions. Like, instead of everyone going to the movies in your friendship group, just watch a streamable service with some, ice cream at home. And she informs us this could be done for $20,
rather than $20 per person.
Yeah, and instead of like having an expensive brunch, go for a walk in the park. But just the fantastic
hard-hitting tips.
I just have to read this. Sorry, it's just
don't
so
apologize.
amazing.
Go on.
Suddenly, I've been reduced to making cuts, making life less fun. Yes, I know other people have much bigger problems than they are facing in these uncertain economic times. At least she sort of acknowledges that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean I'm not allowed to mourn the loss of the benefits of being footloose and fancy-free. I'm young. I should be buying $20 cocktails, getting Ubers home at 2 a.m. from nightclubs with sticky floors, and ordering Uber Eats the next day to treat my hangover. I shouldn't be telling my friends how enraged I am about the rising cost of blueberries, although I'm infuriated. The whole point of being young is that the pressures of children and mortgages don't burden you, and financial decisions don't rule your life. However, suddenly I'm at the point where the cost of a night out is becoming so expensive that I have to forego experiences of my youth to keep a roof over my head. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I added the ladies and gentlemen, that is a national shame. An incredible article, and seemingly not that satirical. And I'd be interested as well. Like, part of my question is this just an Australian thing because we didn't go through the GFC? I think there's this thing around the world, but it's just this really interesting thing that the writer sees it as a national shame that you can't live in this completely irresponsible way and spend money is really, really interesting. I'll just pause for a second just to allow any comments from the millennials in the room.
It seems humorous, but I think there is part of it that you're like, if I really like self-diagnose, there's a truth to it.
Yeah.
That you just kind of assumed life would turn out a certain way. You'd have certain, like, it's the whole entitlement thing. There'd just be things that you would be provided with and be able to do that.
And I also, I'm not sure if it's worth going on this deep dive yet, but like it reminds me of that episode we did later in the year last year about civilizational decline, and wonder if, the millennial generation is just completely unaware of like what cost there is in life, because they've never necessarily had to bear that cost. Whereas the boomer generation has in many ways, particularly in Australia.
Another article which caught my attention, which I think a little bit different, but I think actually still is in the same mood, is there's an article in Bloomberg on technology on 8th of January. And basically it was the story around Seattle's school system is actually going to sue big tech over the youth mental health crisis. So I think it's a class action against, is that the right word for a class action? I don't know exactly what a class action is. I'll just say
I think a class action is where multiple people get together.
Well, they're
to
suing
take action on a thing.
On their class.
Yeah.
So
At least it's a good pun.
It's a good pun, yes, with the school system. So the Seattle schools is putting a case against Meta, which is formerly Facebook, Google, TikTok, Snapchat. I think it's called just Snap. And basically blaming them for addictions that they're creating. And that basically what's going on is a national experiment on kids for profit, and that they're creating anxiety, depression, other psychological trouble. I thought that was a really interesting thing, because what it is it's moving from just sort of lamenting this issue to actually now there's a cost for this, that they're seeing the cost of all of these idealized platforms.
Yep.
They're seeing the cost in mental health for young people, the effect it's having on their school system and the health and well-being of the school system and the young people which come to it. And then they want cost from the actual social media platforms. So I thought that was just another example of sort of cost and sort of that idealism colliding.
Yeah.
The last sort of thing I wanted to speak about sort of before I wind up this segment of this returning to reality and changing expectations is Obviously, in the last week or so, we had the news of the resignation of the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, which got very significant international headlines. And in many ways, the New Zealand Prime Minister, former New Zealand Prime Minister, was I think, sort of touted globally as the anti-Trump in some ways. And perhaps, that's also what people are looking for, a sort of good news story in or particular sort of media outlets in the midst of the sort of rise of populism across the world. And Ardern was sort of boosted, and particularly her sort of leading, I think, through the Christchurch massacre in the mosques. And gained an international sort of brand around her sort of style of politics. She's from the Labor Party of New Zealand, but resigned this week. Some of the things she talked about was not having stuff left in the tank. For those outside of New Zealand politics, it's something John Key, former New Zealand politician, Prime Minister, said when he resigned. But interestingly, I think, obviously the writing was on the wall that Labor was going to lose the next election. And, parties have internal polling, which is far better than what you see the polling outside. But I don't so much want to talk about Jacinda Ardern. I want to talk about the new incoming Prime Minister, Chris. I think his nickname is Chippy, Hipkins. And just this is really interesting. When you think about the Jacinda Ardern era, where it was almost this very high idealism. New Zealand created this wellbeing index. There was this, we're going to take on all these social issues at once. New Zealand's going to keep growing economically. And I'm talking about New Zealand here, but I think this is applicable in many other places.
Sure.
That you can have high economic growth, high social change, high sort of idealism. And I think Jacinda Ardern modeled all of that symbolically for people. But it's really interesting, the language coming through from the new Prime Minister, just in his sort of opening remarks. He said that he will refocus the party. I'm reading here from an article in the New Zealand Herald. Hipkins said he will refocus the party on bread and butter issues. His intention is to focus mainly on the cost of living and issues affecting New Zealand families. He's going to prune Labor's policy program. Really interesting. He said the world is facing a new challenge. Families are struggling. There's a new challenge, a pandemic of inflation. And so his government now would focus on the right now, in quotation marks, and bread and butter issues affecting people. That's fascinating to take apart. Again, reading the media, when you read something like that, a Prime Minister saying in their opening remarks, there have been advisors sitting in a room for some time working this out, like in the West Wing, of what they're actually going to say. So the fact that he's saying right now is this returning to, I think that if you look what's the language behind this, we're moving from the age of these idealistic things, we're going to create this fantastic New Zealand or whatever country it may be in the future, and we now just go like, you're hurting in the present.
Yes.
And bread and butter issues is just a fascinating term they would have thrown around. But really what that means is we're not going to go for these sort of high progressive utopian things. We're going to bring it back to bread and butter issues affecting people. Says this as well, and I think this is really interesting when you link this to that stat of the 1% earning 2/3 of the world's wealth. He says you shouldn't have to be on a 6-figure salary to buy a new house. Hipkins said, my government will bring a strong clarity of sense of purpose to lead New Zealanders through these economic times. And just the final comment I thought was fascinating in this article. I know that some New Zealanders feel we're doing too much too fast, and I have heard that message. That is someone responding to internal polling and focus groups. So what you're seeing is this, I think a reality is back, the realistic 20s, a really interesting way. So that's, I think, the first point as we sort of examine this. Reality is back. And what they're doing is the second point, that's resetting expectations. And people are doing that very with clarity, like the New Zealand Labor Party here, who would have a whole system to work that out, or the writer of the article about how she's no longer ordering Uber Eats, and realizing that her fancy-free and footloose life as a young millennial, that's her self-description, is she has to reset those expectations. Just one more I add, there was a video that went viral in the last couple of days of a young woman who did a TikTok of herself at the Google headquarters in LA and how wonderful it all was, and there was fuzzy rooms and free food and everything, and everything's free, and then there's a video that went viral, came out a few days later, later, I think, which basically she's been sacked with 15,000 other people from Google by Alphabet, which is the parent company. So you're seeing this absolute resetting of expectations. But I think that, I'll leave the next point. I'll just pause here for any commentary from my co-pilots.
I mean, I look forward to talking a little bit about that Google sacking incident.
Yes.
But yeah, Daniel?
This is all fascinating to just, I suppose, see the thread that's through all of these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are you guys seeing this playing out in your everyday?
In terms of reality being back.
Yes.
And resetting of expectations. I think, coming back to that, millennial article, and we are, Daniel and I, millennials, there is, and in the conversations that I'm having with peers and whatnot, there is a reassessing of what is important and how we deal with our money, and in a way that I haven't experienced before. So there is a big shift in that sense.
It's interesting that word reassessing, because in COVID there was this big reassessing.
Yes.
When everyone sort of stopped. But almost we're hitting a second phase in reset. Like it was a reassessing, and now there's almost a resetting of expectations.
Well, because now life to a certain extent has returned to normal.
Yeah.
Whatever that means. But now it's like, life hasn't returned to normal. There is a new normal, to use a term that we've used before. But then it's also attempting to navigate that wisely with so many unknowns before us, because before there was a certain, and we've talked about this is like a networked world kind of grey zone dynamic, that there was an expected course of action, if you did this would happen, and it's going to result in me being able to buy a house, for example, but now it's like, well, I can put all of these things in place that I could before, but I'm not necessarily going to be able to buy the house, or I don't know what the housing market is going to do, or I don't know how secure a job is, or whatever. I mean, you can take me out of that, but like these are the kinds of conversations that are being had.
Yeah.
And there are so many variables and unknowns that it's very difficult to know how to best plan and move forward in so many areas of life.
Well, it's interesting, you're not hearing the new normal anymore. Like the fact that polycrisis, which means many crises, it's a fancy word for that, multiple crises, but they're using the word polycrisis, not the new normal. It's interesting.
Yeah, and even, I feel like in casual conversations over dinner, different people are like, I did have a big trip planned this year, but I don't know if I'm going to do it because it's like really expensive to go overseas, and so there's all these expectations that we've had in the past, I could just like go overseas for a couple of weeks and, have a great time and then come back and still keep living life relatively comfortably, but it's not necessarily a given, or it's definitely not a given anymore. Yeah.
I think one thing I'm noticing is I think often millennials are marked by being a little bit like deconstructive and getting cynical at times about different things. And I almost see people in the tension of going, all right, I've kind of experienced my 20s as with the like hope and promise that I can just live this life, kind of what this article was talking about, however I want. But I know once I get to my 30s, I'll be able to quote unquote settle down and kind of, I don't know, live a more stable life or whatever. And kind of having reached that point in their 30s and early 40s and like, actually I don't have that. And there's almost this like internal thing of going, what do I do with that now? And seeing people that are just actually really cynical and really kind of just deconstructing different things and kind of pointing fingers at politics, industry, whatever it is. But then I think there's a percentage of people that are actually just like burying their head in the sand a little bit and kind of just, I'm just going to choose to ignore this and hope that it kind of goes away. Which, pastorally I'm concerned for. Yeah. Because I don't think this, and I think what we're talking about is this isn't a going away thing. This isn't just like, we'll see this year through and then it'll be all right. Like this is something new.
Yeah.
Well, were you going to say something, Lydia?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I was just reflecting on that, thinking about, what are the flow-on effects for faith? And I guess, I've had a number of conversations with different people, but for me personally, this feels like a challenge and a call to a greater dependence in the bread and butter issues that Chris Hipkins has referred to in
Chippy.
Chippy,
Prime Minister Chippy,
the Prime Minister of New Zealand. But as a person of faith, what does it actually look like to bring all of the really mundane things, things that perhaps I've felt that I've had some kind of control over before God, and acknowledge that actually I have complete dependence, or need to have complete dependence on Him, because I don't know. Yeah. And that's an opportunity for greater surrender and greater submission to God's purposes for His people.
It was just a final comment. I was chatting with a pastor friend overseas last week, and just catching up, seeing how things are going in his context. And he just made the comment that, and he's big fan of Rebuilders and his Cultural Moment podcast, and he just talked about he's seeing essentially what you've been talking about for years, the evangelistic opportunity, because there's so many people in his city now that are just like, oh, that secular myth is a myth, and it's all unraveled very quickly before them, and are now looking for answers and finding that in faith. So it's just interesting to see that starting to unfold, this kind of prophetic sense you've had for years is happening and before us.
Well, I was reading this morning, and I just as a light's gone out there, we'll just keep going as the light's replaced. If you're listening on audio, it's totally irrelevant to you. But Daniel's fixing the light. Well, I make a point that I was reading some stuff this morning I was interested in sort of what revivals and renewals look like in different contexts. And I've actually been looking at our own state here in Victoria.
Yeah.
And just really interesting that there was a gold rush at the end of the 19th century, which then was followed where Melbourne just had this huge economic growth and became one of the richest cities in the world. It was like a Dubai called Marvelous Melbourne in the 19th century, and was ahead of many cities in Europe and America, and then went into this big depression and the housing bubble burst. All sounds very familiar.
Yes.
And but interesting, this article was saying that's when you had this revival. The revival began when the certain churches which weren't set up to the new social reality. So, for example, the Anglicans struggled a bit in our state because they were trying to get Anglican vicars to come out and serve here, but a lot wouldn't come. And I had to sort of smile at this because they said Australians wouldn't respect their sort of social standing, and it just meant nothing to us. But interestingly, the Methodists, which at that time didn't have, also had the problem of preachers and recognised vicars or whatever coming out. The Methodists went in a different direction, and what they did was just really equipped lay people. And often the Methodists would plant a church. There wouldn't be like a planter, a vicar, a minister going out. Just a group of people would start meeting together. But interesting reading this, what they said was that you can often track, that was how it's set up. But then when the revival happened, it really sort of took off. And Methodism became the biggest sort of denomination for a period there in our state. That what happened was you can almost track economic recessions and depressions to revivals.
Wow. And
so there's a famous revival which started on Wall Street when various Wall Street traders began to meet and pray because they saw this 19th century depression happening. So it's interesting the conversations that begin during times like this.
All right, so we've talked about reality is back. There's a resetting of expectations. And then you alluded to this sort of third point that you were going to explore, and this is the notion of the idealist versus the institutionalist in terms of enacting change in a culture or a nation.
So there's the mood shift happening in 2023.
Yep.
Which is, exactly as you said, reality's back, resetting of expectations. But I think what we'll begin to see developing in 2023, and it may just be developing under the surface, but I would say it's this tension between the idealist mode and the institutionalist mode.
Yes.
Okay, so different vehicles for change come through. And this could be at a national level, an international level, in a corporation. It could be in a town. It could be
in a church.
In a church even. Between people have this very idealistic view. They see the preferred future. They're uncompromising on the future they want to have, and they realize how far the present is from that future. So they move forward by animating people with a vision, which requires rapid change, commitment, moving towards this goal. They want a better day. This classically, you think about the Obama sort of campaign.
Yes.
Hope, that classic hope poster. So that's one kind of mode. And I would say we've been in a period where that has been dominant. Now, there's been bad news underneath the surface, but almost that sort of Obama, idealistic, you think of all these things in the culture, activism, companies going from just like, we're spilling chemicals and making obscene amounts of money and we don't care, to like, we are now almost like NGOs of goodness in the world, in corporate responsibility. You've seen this in individuals, identity changing from, a sort of very sort of individualistic, capitalist sort of sense to almost this sort of virtue signaling of how good we are and we love the earth and we do this and we diversity, tolerance, all this sort of stuff. That very idealistic sense. And you've seen organizations, work around that. And there's almost been a sort of bureaucratic class. One of the great arguments is, you see in politics is, should the government run everything or should just the free market run everything? And it's almost a little bit of a moot point, because I think uniting the government and the free market now, there's this bureaucratic class of managers, HR departments, all these kinds of people who have very much been trying to, in a sense, bring about that idealistic change, for a better world. That's what university teaches them. This is all this stuff. Okay, so there's that dynamic, the idealist. But then there's the institutionalist. The institutionalist sets up something which does change, but does it slower. It takes generations. It builds something that goes beyond the individual. It wants change, but it realizes that we also have to change first as well. So, you see the health of many, countries is also linked to their institutional health as well. So you've got, but the institutional slow change thing has actually not been cool. As much as we rely on them and they're working behind the scenes, it's not been cool, because we wanted the faster rate of change. We wanted change to happen very quickly. We wanted the idealistic thing of change. You wanted the Obama hope now versus let's just slowly change things and give your life to an institution and just hope that perhaps your kids, grandkids will see a better world. So those two things are often, as vehicles of change, two modes of change, are often in conflict.
Yeah.
Now, I think what's happening now is, as there's this resetting of expectations, as there is this return of reality, I think we're seeing the importance of those institutions. The fact that you've got people talking about, after January the 6th, the importance of democracy and defending democracy, Ukraine war, the importance of these institutions that are out there, EU or whatever, like defending Ukraine as a liberal democracy, with burgeoning, possibly, like becoming like a sort of healthy institutional democracy. You see this across the world. And even, you go back to Chris Hipkins, Chippy, in New Zealand, he's saying, we're going to do more bread and butter stuff. We're going to talk about the economy. We're going to talk about the cost of living for your families. We're not going to try and go for all these idealistic, big picture stuff. Now, that's going to be hard for that management class, and perhaps even some in the church, who all they've known, particularly, again, this is not just an episode about millennials, but particularly that sort of millennial class who've grown up young with idealism, who now are in their 30s and 40s and getting those leadership positions. When you've been shaped in a way to be idealistic, but the people you're leading are like, we don't want just more management around idealism. You need to make stuff work, and you need to make bread and butter stuff work. And making bread and butter stuff to work is actually hard. Why? Okay. I wonder if also what we're seeing in the great resetting of expectations is that a lot of what we thought was idealism was deeply shaped by the age of the image.
Yeah, okay.
The age of image, of marketing, of public relations, where we can, in a sense, create this wonderful view of a company where you've got the company who is just all about profit and is spilling chemicals in some developing country, yet has this fantastic public ad campaign about how wonderful and tolerant and diverse they are.
Yes.
So we've been in a world which perhaps has thought of itself as idealistic, and perhaps it says some of those things, yet a lot of that has been image management.
Yeah, so it's created a facade
Yes.
that doesn't actually reflect what's going on
Yes.
in reality.
So if you think about, classic, if you say to people, who is someone who symbolized the idealist, you might say a Martin Luther King, or you might say a Gandhi. Well, Martin Luther King and Gandhi got shot.
Yeah.
And died. And I think most idealists in that mode throughout history who've almost had that almost prophetic edge have realized that it's going to come at great personal cost. They may lose their lives. Martin Luther King's very famous sermon the night perhaps before he got shot. I can't remember how long it was before, but he was talking like Moses. He may not get to the promised land. He realized that he may have to give his life. There's this sense, like I remember seeing in New Zealand, in Queenstown, on the beach, there is this Remembrance Day little memorial, and it just has the words service over self.
Yeah.
And so that concept has really shaped most idealists throughout history. But I think because of the age of individualism, the age of the image, people have tried to be idealistic, but instead of with an ethos of self-sacrifice,
Yes.
we've had an ethos of self-creation.
Yeah.
That I want to be idealistic, but this is actually feeding who I am. Is that all of it? No. Am I painting with a broad brushstroke? Yes. Am I perhaps, getting some bits wrong? Yes. But I think where we're moving to now is actually the invitation to a kind of change where we need to have both.
Yeah.
Because, bureaucracies and institutions will sometimes forget that institutional prophetic edge, but also that idealistic prophetic edge, but also the idealistic needs to be brought into the real world.
Yes.
It sometimes has to focus, as Chippy reminds us, on the right now and the bread and butter issues. And I think this is also really important for us as a church. How much of us have entered into ministry, particularly the younger cohort, and many of you listen to this with perhaps the idealistic vision.
Sure. Yeah.
Not realizing that this is actually going to have to cost. And that it's not about self-creation, it's about actually self-sacrifice. And also that will mean sometimes doing the bread and butter stuff, doing the stuff right here, right now, building stuff that will live beyond us. So I think we're moving from a period of disruption, because I think what happened with the idealistic thing, it almost morphed into disruption. Like you look at the political figures who want to tear down, and as you were saying, Daniel, when the idealism is not met, it can turn into deconstruction and tearing down and firing at things from a distance and so on. And I think you've seen this politically in the world.
Yeah.
Even the sort of populists are changing. You've sort of got the thing from a Trump as a disruptor to I've gone blank, Florida, DeSantis, or even Meloni in Italy. They're sort of trying to be populist, but they're trying to build something as well. So I think this is the mood we're going into in 2023. You're seeing these shifts occur, and I think this is a really pivotal year in the global mood.
Yeah, I think you referred to it as a hinge year.
A hinge year.
Earlier. Yeah. Well, I mean, man, we started at a restaurant in Denmark and ended there. So who knew?
We've been everywhere. We've been Denmark. We've been to the Google LA headquarters, New Zealand politics. Wollongong, Seattle school system.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. But yeah, I mean, obviously we're going to dig into some of these ideas more across the year and see what's happening across the world and how, we can continue to explore that. But this is a great place to start. Thank you so much, Mark, for your thoughts and exploration of what's happening.
And can I just end with an encouragement?
Please.
Because I think 2023, you can look at, oh my goodness, polycrisis.
Yep.
But again, polycrisis precedes poly-renewal.
Oh, it's a new year, new slogan.
Love it.
Yeah.
Or an adapted slogan. Yeah. Well, let's pray for it.
Amen.
Yeah. See you guys next week.